Good evening for Telesur. I'm Cody Weddle in Caracas, Venezuela. This is from the south, and we begin with tonight's headline. Former Guatemalan dictator Rios Montt will finally face trial for genocide. We have a special interview coming up. And the border between Venezuela and Colombia remains closed after the discovery of a network of paramilitary activity. Plus, going against naysayers, Argentina's unemployment rate is at its lowest in decades. And good evening once again. To begin, a Guatemalan court has ruled that former dictator Efraín Rios Montt must face retrial for genocide that happened during the country's civil war, but ordered that it take place behind closed doors because he has dementia. Now, the 89-year-old former general who ruled the Central American country from 1982 to 1983 is accused of ordering the army to massacre more than 1,700 Ixomaya indigenous people. Meanwhile, also in Guatemala, but with more current events, 3 more ministers from the cabinet of embattled current President Otto Pérez Molina have resigned. This brings the number of high-profile resignations to 15. Now, among those who have most recently stepped down are the ministers of Communications, Planning, and Finance. The fresh resignations follow the arrest of former Vice President Roxana Baldetti for alleged links to the corruption scandal known as La Línea, or the Line, which involved funneling of custom taxes into private bank accounts. Now, Baldetti is expected to file a request for house arrest. On Monday, the Guatemalan prosecutor lodged the accusations against the former vice president.
Roxana Baldetti Elias, the prosecution indicates that you're a part of a criminal organization of more than 10 people with controls and functions that have clearly been defined, which have been established through a special method using wiretaps and other media. You have consistently been operating as a part of this criminal organization since at last May 2014 until April 2015. This is a criminal organization which you intended to defraud the state of Guatemala.
Meanwhile, now, in spite of increasing public pressure for his resignation, Guatemala's head of state, President Otto Pérez Molina, refuses to step down from office due to additional corruption charges. Now, President Pérez Molina has said that he has nothing to do with the corruption scandal, but last Friday, prosecutors and UN officials investigating the scandal said they had evidence implicating the president in the case. The president did admit that he was responsible for designating the officials involved in the scheme.
With the same strength and character, which I deny my link to that operation, I cannot fail to recognize that this has happened in my administration and with officials selected by me. This forces me to make a public apology. From the bottom of my heart, I apologize to the Guatemalan people.
Moving on now, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro has extended the closure of various border crossings with Colombia. Now, it comes after the discoveries of an extensive network of paramilitary activities at Venezuela's border, as well as massive smuggling of basic goods. Now, Maduro says there is evidence that the political opposition in Venezuela is working with paramilitaries to destabilize the country. He also says that Colombian paramilitaries have received about $32,000 to carry out an attack against Venezuelan troops at the border. Colombian and Venezuelan officials are expected to meet this Wednesday to discuss the situation.
We are looking for a new border. The border is rotten. It is rotten. We are the victims of capitalism, the paramilitary capitalist model of the Colombian right.
Under the leftist government of Argentina's President Cristina Fernandez, the country's unemployment rate has hit its lowest level in more than a couple of decades. For an explanation now, here's our correspondent, Laureano Ponce.
Argentina has just reached its lowest unemployment rate in 24 years. According to a recent report by the National Institute of Statistics and Census, the number of unemployed dropped from 7.3 to 6.6% during the second trimester of the year versus the same period in 2014. Government officials and experts agree that this improvement is a result of boosting the domestic consumption through wealth distribution policies such as social welfare plans.
There are many social welfare programs and social investment policies that remain in place, and at the same time there are salary increases that overcome any inflation index. This is what marks the current economic juncture.
While the government claims this improvement in employment was possible due to counter-cyclical measures, the right-wing opposition keeps demanding a reduction in public spending, arguing that it would bring down inflation. However, many think the effect would be very different.
If we were to analyze the proposals by the opposition, we would not find this, rather the exact opposite. No restrictions on the exchange market, no right to export, several policies that would lead to higher wealth concentration, a less fair wealth distribution. It would be the opposite of the current path.
This drop in the unemployment rate means more than 100,000 new jobs, and it is seen by many economists as especially meaningful in the current international juncture.
This drop in unemployment in Argentina is not common in the current situation in the world. Unlike what is going on in other countries, Argentina has not only sustained its employment rates, but it has also created new jobs.
After these numbers became public, Argentina's Labor Minister, Carlos Tomada, said that the drop in unemployment was not magical, but the result of a political vision which seeks to preserve the living conditions of working families. Laureano Ponce, Telesur, Buenos Aires.
A decision to allow a Canadian company to operate a main oil block sparked protests and a 24-hour strike in Peru. Now it's happening in the department of Loreto in the northeast of Peru. The protests against Pacific Stratus Energy came mostly from the opposition Patriotic Front Party and the General Confederation of Workers Union. Now they blocked the main roads in Iquitos, the capital of the department and home to the main airport in the Amazon region. And staying in Peru, campaigning for presidential elections next year is already underway with a political first this year. Primaries. Our correspondent in Lima now with more.
For the first time in the political history of Peru, primary elections for presidential candidates of parties will be taking place. The feature is being implemented by two leftist political coalitions who have been polling low but are now capturing media attention.
This entails a process of opening the race up, and opening so that as in a democracy people know the decisions and there is a need to be transparent. It should not be possible that the candidates to the most important political office in the country are chosen by small political groups or it is negotiated among those who have the money to pay for the registration of a political party.
Left-wing primary candidate from Frente Amplio, Veronica Mendoza, has been able to captivate the attention of Peruvian citizens. Through an initial campaign using social networks, she has been able to inspire many about a leftist revival. The other leftist coalition who has announced primary elections is Únete.
The left wants to inaugurate a new century, a new round for the left with politics that raise the most central problems of our homeland, and obviously from politics, we recuperate millions of Peruvian women and men who have been excluded.
One of the biggest challenges for parties attempting to represent popular movements is that for years, Main Street private media has mostly been paying attention to only candidates of right-wing parties who serve business interests. Several analysts also see as problematic the fact that the left has not been able to unite in one front.
The problem is that up to now, we don't see that it's possible for any of the two or three factions to reconcile and come to a single candidacy or even at one primary. It has already been talked about on how Únete is going to have its primaries and Frente Amplio is going to have theirs.
The two leftist coalitions will be holding primaries in September and October, and they will have until April of next year to gain support for the general presidential elections. Such time frame puts pressure on the candidates, but Peru has had surprising election results often. Rael Mora, Telesur, Lima.
We go to Colombia now, where the country's FARC rebels have denied the use of sexual violence against women as a weapon of war. Now, the peace talk negotiators met this week to address violence against women during the half-century-long conflict. Guerrilla members, along with public servants and members of women's rights organizations, offered their thoughts. A report in 2013 confirmed the use of sex violence against women as a weapon of war, although it was mostly perpetrated by paramilitary groups in Colombia.
We were able to present our principles and our norms, the behavior of the guerrilla fighters with the civilians, and we also showed how the FARC has never used violence against women or against civilians as a policy or as a weapon of war.
Chile has taken a step toward easing its strict abortion ban after legislators voted to advance a bill that would overturn the prohibition in certain circumstances. The Health Commission of the Chamber of Deputies voted to move forward a bill that would allow abortion in 3 instances. Now, those are if the mother's life is in danger, if the fetus is unviable, or when a pregnancy is a result of rape. Now, the project still faces significant opposition, but many Chileans are in favor of the measure. The refugee crisis in Europe is getting worse with no solution in sight. A look at the refugee crisis in Europe when we come back.
Discover Latin America and the world in our programs. Telesur Reports, The Real USA, the stories behind the tweets. Ataman, Lives, Know Your Body, Open Files. Exposing the conflicts that affect our people. Compelling personal stories and the most controversial events. See it all on telesurtv.net in English. Telesur. Wherever the news, you'll be there. An insight into Africa today. With Bill Fletcher. The Global African, only on telesurtv.net in English. Wherever the news, you'll be there. The truth behind the power. We lift the lid on some of the world's most ruthless figures. Open File, only on telesurtv.net in English. Wherever the news, you'll be there.
Around the world now, record numbers of refugees are streaming into EU member country Hungary from Serbia, posing a new headache for regional leaders. Now, those leaders will meet at a summit this week where we expect Europe's worst migrant crisis since World War II to dominate the discussions. Now, almost 2,100 people, the highest ever daily total, crossed the border near the Hungarian town of Roseke on Monday, just days before Hungary completes a vast razor wire barrier to keep out migrants. And the Italian Coast Guard now has picked up another 466 migrants from stricken boats in the Mediterranean. Last week, over 5,000 migrants, mainly from sub-Saharan Africa, were rescued in the Mediterranean off the Libyan coast. Most were rescued over the weekend, plucked from wooden or rubber boats, and one of the busiest 3-day periods since the Frontex coordinated Operation Triton was launched in November of 2014. Now, the EU is attempting to respond to this crisis.
We are setting up what we call a hotspot approach and sending teams of agents from the 3 different agencies, Europol, Frontex and the Asylum Support Office, to frontline member states, Italy and Greece. The hotspot team approach has already been set up with a regional task force in Sicily, and we're now working to set up the one in Piraeus in Greece. And what these teams will be doing is precisely assisting the frontline member states in processing asylum applications.
Refugees and pro-refugee activists took part in a march against racist asylum laws, as they called it, in Magdeburg, Germany. The protesters, most of them refugees from the Middle East, alongside youth activists from the Anti-Racist Network, called for the rights of asylum seekers to be respected and rejected deportations under the Dublin regulation, which allows Germany to deport refugees to the first country in the European Union that they enter.
Dublin law said that the first country you enter and the first country take your fingerprint, it's responsible for your case, like as a refugee. And that's why we have a problem with this Dublin law, because now in Germany, Germany is not giving us the right to live here, to bring our family.
After fierce battles in the Syrian city of Zabadani, the army carried out its promise to the rapid progress in the city and its surroundings in the fall of opposition. Last Mulberry leaves in the Western Front.
The Syrian army and the Lebanese resistance has a new achievement in the city of Zabadani after seizing control of supply networks from the East Front. This comes days after the Syrian army took control of the western district of the city and has progressed toward the center. A military source confirmed that the military operation killed dozens of enemy combatants.
We are with the Syrian army, which is fighting the Western mercenaries. The truce that was used to under the false premise that there were civilians. Everyone knows that the civilians left Zabadani a long time ago.
On the other hand, in response to the army progress on several fronts, the army of Islam led by Zahran al-Loush is shelling the city of Damascus, which has led to injury of many civilians.
A sad thing, something unfortunate. This barbaric act of terrorism destroyed the car and has killed the innocent. Why? Who's the beneficiary of this destruction?
The missiles made us run into the streets and look for friends in the hospital. But they also increased our resolve and our determination to stay and face this destruction. We will build everything in spite of the losses.
The army's progress means the opposition has lost an important stronghold, stretching from the west of the capital Damascus to Lebanon. Hazem Abdullah, Telesur, Syria.
And we're going to go back now, if you will permit us, to Guatemala, back to Latin America now, where we're talking about the former dictator in Guatemala, Efrain Rios Montt. He will face trial once again for genocide, although the trial will be closed to the public due to his medical condition of dementia. And today this evening we're joined by Graham Russell. He's the director of Rights Action. It's a human rights and community development group. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. For our viewers, I'm just wondering, for those who maybe are not aware of these genocide allegations that have stood against Rios Montt for some time now, if you could give us an overview of what he is exactly accused of.
Well, good evening. And to clarify one point, he was already found guilty of the crime of genocide in May of 2013. And it was an extraordinary legal process that lasted years, and only because of corruption at the highest levels of Guatemala's constitutional court was that very legally sound guilty verdict overturned 10 days later. And so it's not retrying him, it's sort of continuing with the same trial, but having to start over to a certain degree now 2 years later. What happened with the genocides is this was all part of U.S.-backed military regimes operating across Latin America during the worst years of the so-called Cold War. And Guatemala was no exception to that. And in the early 1980s, Guatemala's decades-long state repression spiked and peaked when the government of the presidency of Ronald Reagan began in the United States. And the levels of repression in Guatemala reached genocidal levels in certain Mayan regions of the country. And there was whole-scale massacres of entire villages, and well over 250,000 people were massacred or disappeared during this time. And so it's now, years later, that the surviving victims and human rights groups with international supporters are still trying to have some measure of justice done for the U.S.-backed genocide.
And so what should we be looking for in this trial now? There are even words that he might not be sentenced, and of course we heard that the trial will be behind closed doors because of his medical condition. Explain to us how this trial might play out.
Well, it's going to be a replay. If it even finishes, if it even proceeds to the end, I don't fundamentally know the health conditions of Rios Montt. I wouldn't be surprised if he does have some degree of dementia. I wouldn't be surprised at all if he's faking it. There's too much impunity in Guatemala to get to the bottom of this. But he is an 89-year-old man. But as far as the trial goes, this is just a repetition of what's already happened. And so we already saw what will happen. The Mayan Ixil surviving victors of the genocide will present their testimony in court as to what happened. All kinds of documentary evidence will be provided by the lawyers based on documents they've recovered from the U.S. Government through Freedom of Information requests and from the Guatemalan military to show that at the time that Rios Montt was the head of the military regime in Guatemala, fully backed by the United States, he planned and carried out massacres in indigenous regions throughout the country. And in the Mayan Ixil region, that's one of the regions where the degree and type of massacre that occurred was so egregious and so focused on the indigenous people that it was found to be genocide. So the trial will play itself out, if it even gets that far, the way it already played itself out 5 years ago.
And you know, this comes at a time where we're also following these allegations against the current president, Otto Perez Molina, for corruption. And you're also talking about sort of deep-seated institutional corruption and institutional problems there in Guatemala. This is not a problem foreign to some of those Central American countries there. Why is this institutional corruption, why has it not been, does it seem like it has not been overcome at all?
I've worked for 25 years in Central America on these types of human rights and poverty-related issues. And I think one of the elephants in the room is the ongoing role of the international community, the quote-unquote international community. So if you take a country like Guatemala, through all the years of the so-called peace process in the 1990s and the so-called transition back to democracy in the 1990s and into the 2000s, there was no fundamental change whatsoever in how this profoundly unjust, profoundly racist, and repressive country operated. And at the very same time, international institutions like the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank and global resource extraction companies, like many Canadian mining companies, for example, were happily doing multi-million-dollar business deals with the very regime, governments in power in Guatemala that had planned and carried out the genocide 20 and 30 years before. And so I think there's a huge amount of responsibility on behalf of certain governments, particularly the governments of the United States and Canada, and certain global economic actors like the development banks and multinational mining companies, because the power and wealth of the regime in power, the corrupt government in power in Guatemala, comes from its ongoing international economic and business relations, economic and political relations, and from its ongoing military support from the United States government.
And so any change there might not only involve the will there in Guatemala, but from abroad and also from the United States. All right, Mr. Graham Russell, he's the Director of Rights Action, a human rights and community development group. Thanks so much for your analysis this evening.
Thank you.
And we move on now. We continue with our world news coverage, where relatives of the 4 abducted Hamas members protested at the Legislative Council in Gaza on Tuesday, urging Egypt to secure their release. More now from our correspondent, Noor Harazin.
Dozens of relatives of 4 Hamas militants who were abducted recently in Egypt protested together with Hamas lawmakers at the Legislative Council in Gaza Tuesday morning. A spokesperson for the families called on Egypt to ensure their safe return home. He also called on President of the Palestinian Authority Mahmoud Abbas and his Prime Minister Rami Alhamdulillah to act quickly to ensure their release. Telesur met with the Abu Jubain family. Their son is one of the 4 abducted Palestinians in Sinai. His father, Saeed, said that they live in fear as they don't know anything about their child.
ما طالبنا إنه
I don't know if my son is alive or dead. Our basic demand is to find our abducted sons and bring them back safely to their families. They were students. Human rights law states that humans have the right to learn, travel, work, and express their opinion safely and without any obstacles. We hope that all parties cooperate to bring back our sons. Thanks to anyone who took part and is taking part in looking for them.
Last Wednesday, Egyptian security sources said that 4 Hamas members were abducted at gunpoint when a bus carrying travelers from the Rafah border crossing en route to Cairo airport was attacked by unknown militants. The Gazan authorities initially blamed the Egyptian intelligence for their abduction on basis that the bus was escorted by Egyptian security officers. However, Egyptian officials confirmed that the kidnapping was clearly the work of Islamic State militants. Nur Harazin, Telesu TV, Gaza.
And a little bit of volleyball now to help loosen the tensions in war-torn Libya. In the city of Zawara, about 160 kilometers west of the capital of Tripoli, they held a friendly volleyball competition last weekend, organized by the city's municipal council despite the unrest currently rocking the country. A team of amateur players joined the Libyan players for a match on Sunday. An Iranian film on the life of the Prophet Muhammad has triggered some controversy in some mostly Sunni countries, but its director, Mahid Mahidi, is hopeful it will improve the violent image of Islam in the Western world. Islam does not allow the depiction of the Prophet's face, so Mahidi has managed to do the film without showing the protagonist's face. Now, he was able to do that thanks to a steady cam especially for him that always shows his point of view. Now, the film is the most expensive of Iranian cinema with a cost of $40 million. It is the first of a trilogy on the life of the Prophet. That's what we're covering on this Tuesday evening here from Caracas. Plenty more on those stories and others at our website, telesurtv.net/English. For Telesur English, I'm Cody Weddle. We'll see you back here tomorrow.